Hi, I'm Ethan Bonner-Mesquita. I'm the Dean of the Harris School, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this event. When we think about the Harris School and the role of a public policy school, not just in the life of a university, but in civic life, in the life of our country and our world, one of the things I believe, and I think the Harris School really believes, is that universities are places where people have time to think hard and slowly about exceptionally important problems, and that society gives us enormous resources and enormous forbearance for our strangeness to work on those problems. And then in exchange, when there are great societal questions on which our expertise can be of use, it is our absolute obligation to put the knowledge that we've been privileged to spend our lives accumulating to work in the public service. And I think there is nobody at the Harris School who exemplifies that mission and those values better than Professor Ludwig, who has spent his career studying the most important problems faced by our societies, faced by our cities, and who does so in a way that really deeply embodies our values. He is as committed to analytical rigor, to evidence-based advice, to thinking hard and clearly and skeptically, to figuring out what's true and what's false, and to saying it plainly and honestly as anybody in the academy. But he is also a person who very deeply understands that the role of an academic, and especially the role of an academic expert, is to go into the policy debate with humility. That it is our role to bring our expertise, to tell people what we believe, what the best evidence and analysis suggests is true and false. But it is not our place to settle all the questions, that policy questions are deep and hard questions that, yes, involve questions of true and false, questions of effective or ineffective, but also are questions that involve values, involve societal goals, and that our role as policy experts, our role as scientists, our roles as academics in the public service is to meet society where it is, to take seriously the values brought to us by our society, by our elected leaders, by the democratic process, so that we can be positive inputs to helping society make more effective, better policies that are viewed as legitimate because they represent shared values, not values imposed on high from experts. And Jens, whose work so deeply embeds with political institutions, with government institutions, with policy institutions, and tries to answer questions as honestly and rigorously as possible that they want to know the answers to, is an exceptional model of that. So this book that we're lucky and privileged to get to hear about tonight is the result of an unbelievable number of years and the unbelievable amount of work on the question of gun violence, on the question of crime, on the question of how to make our society safer. There is nobody who has done more serious scientific work on that than Jens. There is nobody who can bring more expertise to the public discourse with greater authority and with greater humility. So it's a real joy that we're getting to put on this event, and we are lucky that we're going to hear Jens in conversation with David Axelrod, who is, as you all know, both a giant of American politics, a great friend of evidence-based policy, and a great friend of the Harris School. I can't wait, so I'm going to stop talking, and please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, for that. You say society generously gives us the resources to do the work that we do. May it continue to be so. A little political aside there. You also, first of all, let me say, this is a very, very tough and tractable problem that you've been studying for decades. But I come here more optimistic, not just because of your book, but because people often said to me, yeah, the day you solve this problem is the day we'll have a pope from Chicago. So, you know, these miracles can happen. But talk to me, before we get into the substance of the book, just a couple of minutes on you. Ethan mentioned how much time and how much of your life you've spent on this. Why? Why was this such a focus and has been such a focus of your activity?
Yeah, great. I moved from Washington, D.C. to the University of Chicago in the fall of 2007. And that first fall here on campus, there was a doctoral student from Senegal named Amadou Sis in the chemistry department. So if you think about his family 5 years before that, the University of Chicago chemistry department is one of the best chemistry departments in the world. His family gets a letter that says, your kid is going on a full ride to one of the best chemistry departments in the entire world. The family has won the Willy Wonka golden ticket. Finishes his dissertation in the fall of 2007. 2 weeks after he defends, he's coming home from an ice cream social. At 1:30 in the morning, his apartment is, I think, a block or two from where we are right now. Someone robs him at gunpoint and shoots him point blank in the chest with a stolen .22, and he dies. And that led to a lot of soul searching at the University of Chicago. We like to go around and say we've won more Nobel Prizes than any other university in the world. But here we can see we're not having nearly as much impact as we should, literally in our own backyard. So it led to a lot of conversation on campus about what we could do to be more helpful to our home city of Chicago and cities more generally. And usually when universities think about answering that question, they think about things like, let's send 5 undergraduates out to tutor at the local elementary school. So running tutoring programs is not something that the University of Chicago is particularly good at. But a couple of years before this, in 2004, the National Academy of Sciences had just issued a big blue ribbon commission 300-page report about what we know from the data and evidence about how to reduce gun violence in America, and the conclusion was nothing. And I thought, that's the sort of problem that a great urban research university should try and solve. And so we thought, how can we be helpful in addressing the problem? And the government is the whole ballgame in this area. And almost everything the government is doing doesn't have any evidence behind it. The National Academy of Sciences just told us that. So we set up my research center at the University of Chicago Crime Lab to essentially be sort of the R&D partner to the government, to work with them to try and figure out what the causes of these problems are and what the government can do to be more effective, to try and get more kind of social good per dollar spent. And so that's, the book in many ways is sort of the lessons that we've learned from doing that from the last 18 years.
So here we are 18 years later, and you've written this book, and one of your conclusions is that many of our assumptions were wrong, or at least insufficient, that the orthodoxies of the left and the right are both wrong about how to approach this issue, at least to make progress in the short run. Talk a little about that.
Yeah. You know, the convention, if you look at survey data, almost all Americans, when you ask them what causes gun violence, will give you one of two explanations. So people who tend to be sort of right of center say some version of gun violence is due to morally bad people who just aren't afraid of whatever the criminal justice system is threatening them with. And so the only thing that you can do is disincentivize gun violence by threatening people with ever bigger criminal justice sticks. People who tend to be left of center say...
Let me just add, also, or with a gun itself.
Yeah.
So the only, the only thing that can stop a bad person with a gun is a good person.
Is a good person with a gun. Yeah.
Is the
yeah.
So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so some sort of deterrence,
Right.
Or just locking people up, deterring them, is the sort of right of center answer that we've been thinking about. And if you're on the left, you tend to think that gun violence is due to economically desperate people. They're doing whatever it takes to feed themselves or their families. And that leads you to think the only way to reduce gun violence is to disincentivize it by improving the alternatives to crime. So jobs programs, social programs that make it easier for people to survive without having to turn to crime. And that's been basically, as working on the book, I spent a lot of time reading the history of criminal justice policy in America, and that's exactly the debate that we were having all the way back in the 1930s. That's FDR debating whoever the Republican candidate for president was then. So we've been having this same debate for 100 years, and we've been making absolutely no progress on the problem. So the murder rate today is almost exactly the same as it was in 1900, in contrast to almost every other public health problem that's gotten better. And so that's led me to think we need to see this in a different way if we want to make progress. And just to sort of tee up, I think, the Achilles heel of both conventional wisdoms. Notice that both the conventional wisdom of the left and the right share an assumption, share an implicit assumption, which is like, you're on the right, you think the problem is you need to incentivize people with sticks. You're on the left, you need to incentivize people with carrots. Both sides there implicitly think that before anyone pulls a trigger, they're engaging in some sort of deliberate kind of comparison of the pros and cons of what they're about to do, right? That's what leads you to think that incentives matter, is that people are actually thinking about incentives before they act. And I think that's maybe the key point where we started to go sideways, because as we started the crime lab, we locked my friend Harold Pollack in the basement of the Chicago Police Department headquarters at 35th and Michigan Avenue and said, don't come out until you've read a year's worth of homicide case files involving victims 18 and under.
Yeah, good thing Harold didn't have a gun. Huh?
Good thing Harold didn't have. That's why we locked the door. And you can see the overwhelming majority of shootings in Chicago are not premeditated or motivated by economic considerations. They're arguments. And that's not when any of us are really responding to incentives. So no wonder our policies haven't done more good.
Yeah, I think you said 80% or so of the crimes are of that nature. And you talk about, you sort of hinted at it there, but you kind of applied a basic premise of behavioral economics that Daniel Kahneman, one of the great figures in the history of behavioral economics, Nobel Prize winner, wrote about in his classic work. It talked about thinking slow and thinking fast. Talk about that, because that's central to a lot of your analysis.
Yeah. I think the key reframing for me, so maybe one thing to just say is the national conversation, I think, has been going down the wrong track for 100 years, which is why we haven't made more progress. But one of the really striking things to me in working on the crime lab, as we've been going around the city of Chicago, working with government agencies and nonprofits, is people who work on the front lines and see this problem every day, they've been seeing the problem very clearly. And I think in many ways, to the extent to which there are good ideas in the book, it's really assembling what we've learned from practitioners and then linking it to some larger conceptual framework that helps you see all of these things that practitioners have come up with cohere and make sense.
Before you answer the question that I asked, let me ask you the one that I should have asked first.
Okay.
Which is, you're not saying that the proliferation of guns, because we have, I think the last number I saw, and you'll know the right statistic, was that America had 46% of the privately owned guns in the world, and 4% of the population, 400 million guns in a country of 330 million people. Your point isn't that isn't a problem, but your point is that is a problem in combination with something else, that there's violence everywhere, but the proliferation of guns and the instincts that drive violence together are the problem here.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think the data make very clear. So in principle, having lots of guns around, guns are super useful in crime because they're easily concealable and super lethal. That also, in principle, makes them useful for self-defense as well. So it's an empirical question about what happens when you have more guns in circulation. It turns out that the data suggests that when countries have more guns, that leads to more murders. And so if anybody here had a button that you could push that would make the 400 million guns in America disappear, you would on net make the country much safer.
If you raise your hand if you
have that button
here, that would be.
We could just call it for the rest of the night.
Yes.
But nobody has that button, and we can all see that gun control politics in America are going to be stuck at least for the next few years, right? And so I think in many ways, this getting to your question, in many ways the book is suggests, I think a lot of people look at that and say we're just totally screwed. 400 million guns are not going anywhere. Gun control is stuck. This problem, let's just give up and move on to the next thing. And the book argues that, gun violence essentially is gun availability plus the willingness of people to use guns to hurt other people. So gun violence is guns plus violence. And if the guns part of this problem is stuck, the good news is that we have a second avenue along which we can push to try and make progress, which is to reduce the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another. And so it looks hopeless when you're looking at the statistics on the prevalence and you're looking at the headlines about what's going on with gun control debate. But there is this other direction that we could be going, and I think there's a lot of very feasible things there that give us room for optimism.
And you made the point in the book that there are other countries where there's at least as large a propensity toward violence, but because of the relative lesser proliferation of guns, that violence is expressed in ways that are less lethal.
Yeah, exactly. And one way you can sort of see this is that countries with almost exactly the same gun ownership rate, like Switzerland and Canada have the exact same gun ownership rate per capita, but Canada has a way higher murder rate than Switzerland. And that shows you that this other margin of violence also matters a lot. And so if you can get that under control, even with a lot of guns around, you can make a big difference.
So proceed and talk about the thing that I asked you about before, which
excellent.
is System 1 and System 2.
Yeah, so the big light bulb moment for me was we were in the juvenile detention center on the west side of Chicago down on Roosevelt Road, and one of the staff leaders there said to us, he said, 20% of the kids in here, they're just psychopaths. You let them out, they're going to hurt other people. But the other 80%, I always say to them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And that speaks to this thing that if you haven't read Danny Kahneman's amazing book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it'll change your thinking about public policy. It'll change your thinking about yourself. I always say it's sort of the user's manual for your own mind. It's really hard to.
You actually used an example. I mean, I guess the example we can all relate to, or at least I know I can, is road rage, where you just, somebody cuts in front of you and you go nuts.
Yeah.
And you're cursing and you're chasing them and yours was walking your dog and having some neighbor's dog attack your dog.
Yeah.
Read the story because you do not want to mess with this man's dog, okay?
Well, I'll just very quickly tell you a story and link it to the Danny Kahneman's idea. So every Wednesday morning, I have like a 6:30 a.m. call with the leadership team of the crime lab. And so I put on my AirPods, I leash up my 65-pound German Shepherd hound dog mix Iko. And so we lived here on Harper at the time, just south of Powell's Books. I call into the leadership team. We're walking around Hyde Park, and I hear the most ferocious, blood-curdling, barking, snarling, and I look, and there's a dog off-leash tearing down a driveway at me, at Iko. And, in Kahneman's book, he talks about there being two channels of thought that we all engage in, like the voice in our head that we think of as thinking, the part of our minds that have the potential to be rational. He calls slow thinking, or System 2, if you've read the book. And the problem with slow thinking is it's slow and it's super mentally effortful. And so our minds are designed to do as little of it as possible. And what we wind up doing most of the time is engaging in really fast or System 1 thinking. It's basically a series of automatic responses that we engage in almost automatically, almost involuntarily. We don't even realize it. These are automatic responses that are adaptive for things that we see over and over again, right? And like one of the things that System 1 was very useful to System 1 over like an evolutionary perspective was to make a very quick assessment of what situation we're in. And to do that very quickly and effortlessly, our fast thinking chooses between just two settings on the mental dial, fine or end of the world, nothing's worse than this. So my rational self would have looked at this and thought, I have lots and lots of different solution strategies for this dog running down the street. I could have picked my dog up. I could have stood between that dog and my dog.
That would have been the heroic thing to do.
That would have been the heroic thing to do. The worst case scenario, if my dog gets attacked, it's just an extra vet trip, like no big deal. But my slow thinking was nowhere to be found in this moment. So I catastrophized. I literally thought nothing is worse than having my dog attacked. And I just unleashed every 4-letter, 7-letter, and 12-letter word. These are words that you have never heard, so I don't want to repeat them.
We don't do that
in front of you and corrupt you. Yeah. Like every filthy, horrible thing.
We call them presidential words.
We call them presidential words. Or Chicago mayor words, depending on which mayor we're talking about. Like, you name it, I'm sure Rahm Emanuel could have learned something from this tapestry of horrible, terrible profanity. It horrifies me to think that I said these things. With the Crime Lab leadership team on my headphone listening to Kim Smith here from the Crime Lab heard every horrible thing that I said.
Hence his willingness to admit it.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can already start to see, like, my fast thinking led me, so clearly what happened here is the dog just slipped its leash and got off, right? And I just lost my mind because anything is better than having my dog attacked, which is not really the case if I would have just paused for 1 second and thought about it. And interestingly, his fast thinking system, so from his perspective, it's like, my dog slipped the leash, dogs sometimes slip their leashes. And all of a sudden, like, you are screaming these horrible things at me in front of my own house with my wife and kids inside having breakfast. Like, what? So then he just went to DEFCON 1 as well, right? And luckily, so like, and he was like a doctor at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Like, the whole thing was just super embarrassing, ridiculous, whatever you want to call it.
This is how academics fight.
This is yeah. During the reception, Ethan can tell you what the Harris School faculty meetings are like. And the key here, this is going to be relevant for thinking about solutions later on. So the key here is if you're in Hyde Park or you're part of the University of Chicago community, you know that the University of Chicago hires an insane number of private security guards to stand on almost every street corner and drive around in these white patrol cars with green lights up top. That's a version of what Jane Jacobs was writing about 65 years ago in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is
Eyes on the Street.
Putting eyes on the street. And luckily for us, the private security guard was driving by as, this guy's yelling at me, I'm yelling at him, my 65-pound dog is standing there just looking around like everything's fine. I was like, thanks a lot. And the security guard rolls down the window and says, is everything all right here, or do I need to call the police? And were it not for that, I have no idea where this would have gone. And just to preview, like, if you go a mile in that direction, you are not going to have a University of Chicago private security guard or any eyes on the street around to interrupt once something goes sideways. And if you go a mile south of where we are now, you're much more likely to inject a gun in that argument. And that helps you start to understand why there's so much variation in the gun violence problem across neighborhoods.
You also introduced an interesting element here in that you studied two neighborhoods, both just south of here, South Shore and Grand Crossing, separated by Dorchester Avenue. And you found, despite the fact that there were so many similarities between these neighborhoods, there was a dramatic difference in the number of shootings and homicides in the two neighborhoods. And so talk about that and what conclusions you drew from that.
Yeah, great. So, if you want to take a post-talk stroll, just walk down Dorchester Avenue about 0.8 of a mile to 71st and Dorchester. There's at 71st and Dorchester on your right, on the west side of the street, you will see Easy Tree Recycling. Their motto is, a tree is a terrible thing to waste. And that is the boundary between South Shore to the left, so to the east, and Greater Grand Crossing to the west. And the interesting thing about these two neighborhoods is conventional wisdom gives you no way to understand why the shooting rate is twice as high per capita west of Dorchester Avenue than east. So the gun laws are exactly the same. The criminal justice system is exactly the same, east and west of Dorchester Avenue. It turns out that the poverty rates in the two neighborhoods are exactly the same, and the racial composition of the two neighborhoods are the same, right? So, and yet, twice as many shootings on the west side as on the east side. So when people say things like, we're never going to solve the gun violence problem until we end poverty and segregation in Chicago, there has to be, A, that would be super depressing if it were true, and B, it just doesn't seem right given that there's all of this additional variation across neighborhoods. And so to tie it back to this idea of eyes on the street, one of the key differences between the two neighborhoods, if you just think about Chicago geography here, South Shore developed along the greatest thing in Chicago, which is the lakefront here. And so historically, there's just developed a lot more commercial in South Shore interspersed with residential, which, as Jane Jacobs was writing about 60-something years ago, gets a lot more people out and about, a lot more adults in particular.
Does South Shore Drive have anything to do with that as well? Because it's a pretty significant commercial strip there. Yeah,
so there's just a bunch of north and southbound streets in South Shore. Like when you look at the map, there's less vacant land in South Shore than Greater Grand Crossing. There's more commercial in South Shore versus Greater Grand Crossing. There's just a lot more people out and about. So when someone is acting like an idiot and somebody else is acting like an idiot with them, there's just more likely to be someone to step in and diffuse it.
And do people step in, or is there not fear about stepping into the middle of these things?
Yeah, I think, the one way to think about it is the danger to a passerby for stepping in depends on where in the life cycle of the argument you are, right? At some point, I was, I went through a multi-year period where I would drive around with the gang homicide team for the south side of Chicago just to try and understand this problem better. And we were driving in the 70s, just a couple miles south of where we are, a neighborhood. The nickname that the kids have for it is Terror Town, to give you a sense for what the neighborhood's like. And I asked the detective who was driving me around, I said, tell me about the latest case that you're working on. And he said, some kid gets off the CTA stop here, is walking down the sidewalk, steps on another kid's sneakers. The one kid says, I think you should apologize. The first kid who stepped on the sneakers said, I don't feel like apologizing, probably not that politely. And then someone winds up dead. So at the point that someone's got a gun out, I think most of us would not be willing to step in. But at the point where you've got two teenagers on a sidewalk arguing about something like that, I think a lot of people would be willing to step in, especially people who live there and have a sense of who's who in the neighborhood and so on.
Yes, so part of that implies that if the neighborhood is inviting, if you don't have a lot of abandoned buildings and empty lots, if you have some commercial development that brings people out on the streets, that encourages a culture of intervention.
Yeah. And notice also, none of this makes sense through the lens of conventional wisdom, right? If you think the people who are pulling triggers are like psychopathic super predators or economically desperate, they're about to starve if they don't do whatever crime they're contemplating, right? Then adding an eye to the street should make no difference because, if you're a super predator or you're on the verge of starvation, you are persistently motivated to engage in crime. You're just going to wait for the eyes on the street to turn the corner. It is only this sort of behavioral economics perspective, like 10-minute windows driving violence, that get you to see that an insanely serious behavior could have surprisingly fleeting motivation. That's the very weird pairing, I think, that you get with the behavioral economics perspective, and that helps you see why external intervention then can be super helpful. And maybe just the one other thing that I would add to this is the effects are not small, and we have this from really, really good evidence, right? So there was a great study from LA where they look at what happens. LA passed some law that shut down all of their marijuana dispensaries on one day. They were just done after that, and there was a huge fall in foot traffic around the marijuana dispensaries. And you can see that violence rates go up by something like 10 or 20% in the vicinity when the foot traffic falls.
Could be people were a little less chill with all the dispensaries.
Could be people, yeah. That's a different sort of, I think we're running that experiment now, actually. Just as another example, this amazing research team at the University of Pennsylvania a few years ago, they have thousands and thousands of vacant lots in Philadelphia as we do in Chicago. The Penn people somehow convinced the city of Philadelphia to let them randomly select which vacant lots they would turn into pocket parks. So like tall grass, beer cans, heroin baggies, used condoms, you see this all over the city of Chicago. They have it all over Philadelphia. They turn into these really nice pocket parks. The survey data show that draws people out of their homes. And then in poor neighborhoods, when you clean up that park, you see reductions like 20 or 30% in the gun violence rate. So you can see 10 or 20% from adding some stores, 20 or 30% from cleaning up vacant lots. Like these environmental design things, like these are not small changes. These are not small changes.
Oh, that's what I needed, yes, thank you. I did a podcast with the mayor of Detroit last year, and they made a big effort they had a huge problem with abandoned lots, and they made a big effort to get people to adopt these lots, turn them into gardens and parks and so on. Has that had have you had a chance to study that? Has that had any sort of effect there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Philadelphia experiment, I think, has now been replicated in different places, and you see similar benefits from fixing up abandoned houses or tearing them down. And so I don't see any obvious reason why the results from the few cities that have done those experiments wouldn't generalize to places like Detroit and Chicago and so on. So I think all of that stuff, which sounds like a distraction from really addressing the problem, I think turn out to be a surprisingly helpful part of the solution.
So on this sort of slowing down and intervening and causing people to think in more reflective terms about what's going on, that implies that deterrence is meaningful. I was interested. You celebrate, as you should, one of the pioneers here in terms of community intervention programs, Dr. Chico Tillman, and he talked about a situation where he was intervening in a kind of gang reprisal situation, and he said to over a social media slight, which is an issue that you don't cover that much in this book, but is a big problem here. God knows that's something that triggers irrational responses. All you have to do is read them to know that. So you say, he said to them, if I know that you're the one who's going around shooting everyone in this other gang, don't you think the cops know by now too? And the implication of that was, you're going to get in trouble for doing that. You could go away for doing that. And so, the question is, how much deterrence is the right kind of deterrence? And the fact that we only in Chicago arrest people in 6% of the shootings, doesn't that sort of send a signal that the odds are not, even if you get to the second process, that the odds aren't that bad here. I'm not likely going to go away for this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've been working with the Chicago Police Department to do is to think about whether we could increase the clearance rate for non-fatal shootings. So when 5% of these wind up in an arrest, people take it into their own hands. You can just imagine all of the horrible follow-up consequences of this. I think if you think about what Chico is doing in that moment, really essentially what he's doing is he's trying to get this gang, the other guys stole something from them. They talked smack about it on social media. They just started to go through and kill one by one everybody in the other gang. And then they called in Chico.
That's not like a spontaneous decision, though, is it? That seems like a considered decision.
Yeah, well, so I think what system one, so the fast thinking sets an assumption here, which is like, we got to kill all of these guys. Like, we're just going to kill all these guys. And all of the slow thinking and everything that happens downstream of that is informed by this fast thinking assumption up here that we never think to. So our friend Anuj Shah calls this thinking past, not just thinking fast. Like your fast thinking is setting an assumption and everything, you're never revisiting that. And so I think what I think of as Chico doing there is in some sense helping this guy use his slow thinking to basically make him more deterrable. Right, so like the first question that Chico asked this guy, so they call Chico in to try and mediate this thing, and the first thing that Chico asked the guy is, he's like, these motherfuckers, they stole this watch, we don't care about the watch, but it's the shit talk on the, whatever. And Chico turns to him and says, what do you want? And, Chico says, as soon as he asked the guy the question, it was like he'd been hit by a ton of bricks. It was like, oh yeah, and then he followed it up with the question of like, if I know that you guys are doing this, don't you think the cops would? And I think that speaks to this idea, like, it's not that property crime turns out to be quite deterrable with the threat. So I'm not saying that deterrence doesn't work. I'm saying that property offending seems to be done in a state of mind that lends people to be more deterrable than violent crime, which tends to be arguments when we're engaged in fast thinking and not thinking clearly. And one way to think about what Chico's doing is making people more deterrable and enhancing the deterrent effect of the criminal justice system, there are lots of other ways that we could do that as well. But so I would think about, I wouldn't say, let's close down the whole criminal justice system and just do this instead. I would view these things as like super importantly complementary rather than substitutes.
Yeah. On the other hand, you do say that mass incarceration, let's leave the moral implications aside, but the mass incarceration has had some but limited impact, and it's had some perverse effects as well by keeping people incarcerated who actually could be a calming influence in the community, and by ripping up community.
Yeah. I mean, the huge increase in the incarceration rate since the 1970s in the United States has had some effect on the violent crime rate in America, but at super high cost. So one of the things that, that social scientists had been fixated on for decades and decades is really the benefit side of the equation of incarceration, like the whole hundreds of papers, if not thousands of papers about what is the effect of incarceration on crime. And then at some point, someone started to ask, well, what do we know about the costs of incarceration? Surely they're not limited just to the dollar cost on the government budget. And then we started to see like incarceration is terrible for people and families and employment in all sorts of ways. And so I think one of the main problems with mass incarceration, like when people started to push for mass incarceration in the 1970s, I think they recognized the downside of it in the form of all of these costs, but thought there was no alternative, right? Because all of the research in up through the 1970s suggested we didn't know anything about how to prevent crime. If that were the only thing that we could do to address crime, I think we could have a conversation about whether we really need to incur those high costs or not. I think the main problem with mass incarceration is now we have learned a lot, and we can see that there are ways to prevent crime at much lower cost than prison, if that makes sense.
Yes. One of the reasons that you said that it could have a perverse effect is because most of this crime is being conducted by or committed by young people who are more prone to be reactive in the moment.
Yeah.
Whereas when people age, they tend not to be as reactive in the moment.
Yeah. And just maybe to piggyback on that with one kind of solution challenge that's raised by this. So, the peak offending ages, like the highest risk of someone involved in crime, as David said, is like late adolescence, early 20s. And then your risk of crime involvement declines. But the key thing that I didn't really quite realize until we started the crime lab and I started to work a lot with the city is that decline with age is pretty slow. And so, the per year risk is really high for teens, but there are way more people 18 to 34 than there are 15 to 18. And so when you look at the shootings in Chicago, the overwhelming majority of them are done by men 18 to 34, not by teenagers. And the reason that that's relevant from sort of a solutions perspective is, the social safety net that we have in America, dating back to the 1930s, was built on the premise that working age men would be working. So we spend a huge amount of money helping moms with kids and elderly people. And when you look at what the safety net is for working age men. We have the earned income tax credit for people who are working, but if you're working age and you're not working, there's really not much for you. And that creates a huge challenge for any effort to try and implement the sorts of programs, like fund the sorts of programs that could help people to better navigate these sort of 10-minute windows, because cities and states are on their own. They don't have any sort of dedicated federal funding stream that could help them.
Square that with I think they took it somewhere where there was an excerpt of your book and the headline was "Jobs Won't Stop a Bullet." And you make the point the data reflects that, just pure income is not the decisive factor here. But aren't there other elements of jobs that are equally important that go to, A, getting off the street? Like you've said, summer jobs have some impact, keeping young people occupied. So getting people off the street, but also inculcating people with some community, some need to develop System 2 skills, some sense of self-worth. Aren't those things elements here? Can you just reduce it to an arithmetic kind of income issue? Yeah.
So this was one of the most surprising conclusions from the social science research to me is, because everybody in Chicago says some version of nothing stops a bullet like a job. Like, this is just something that I've heard for 18 years since I moved to Chicago in 2007. And the social science data, there are a few exceptions, as you note, but to a first approximation, the social science data says that that's not true, right? And jobs programs to people coming out of prison, more generous social programs, either for the general public or to people coming out of prison, those things they make people better off materially, which is something that's really important for its own sake. They reduce people's involvement in property crime. They don't reduce people's involvement in violent crime. For the same reason that when I'm screaming at my neighbor, none of us is thinking about what our monthly paycheck is and thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna jeopardize my whatever, right? You're just not in that frame of mind at the time. Now, and in fact, when you look at aggregate when state level economic conditions get better, murder rates actually go up. And I think the explanation there is that when people have more money, they spend more time at bars and whatever, and that winds up leading to more friction. So that effect winds up dominating whatever sort of crime preventing effect there would be. The one important exception, I think there are two really important, actually, let me focus on the exception you mentioned. The one really important exception is summer jobs for teens. And what's interesting about that, in some sense, that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. The interesting thing about summer jobs for teens is the kids who benefit the most in terms of reduced violence involvement are not the ones who benefit the most economically, right? Like when you look at follow-up employment and earnings after the summer, a bunch of kids sort of stay on, their annual earnings or get boosted the most. Those are not the ones who are being deterred or steered away from crime. It's a bunch of other kids who wind up experiencing the biggest delta on their violent crimes. And I think the leading hypothesis for that is that for teenagers, summer jobs seem to be some sort of human capital intervention. I think it's, as you described, like a way for kids to kind of learn a little bit more about how to manage their fast thinking with their slow thinking. That doesn't seem to hold for 20-something and 30-something-year-old people.
So you champion these community intervention programs here. Talk about the measure of success that causes you to endorse this as a pretty significant strategy to reduce these violent crimes, these gun crimes.
Yeah. So these let me just very quickly. So these there are a bunch of nonprofits around Chicago that hire people to step in and mediate conflict called violence interrupters. And let me just very quickly explain why I have come to think about them as helpful and what the evidence is, and then we'll. So I was again in a police car a couple of years ago. There's a call for big brawl in the middle of the street. They turn on the lights and sirens. They race over there. There's like 30 people in the middle of the street fighting. And cops get out of the car. What's going on? Turns out teenage girl on this side of the street had been dating teenage boy on this side of the street. They break up. Someone in the teenage girl's family decides it's a good idea to walk across the street, walk into the boy's house, and in front of his family, punch him right in the face. And hence, you've got 30 people brawling in the middle of the street. So the cops get out. They find out what's going on. They're like, OK, everybody get back into your house. If we have to come back, we're going to arrest all y'all. And then we get in the car and we're driving off. And I say to the sergeant who's driving, I said, do you think that like, it's clear that that is acute in the moment interruption, right? There was like literally no shooting for the 10 minutes that the cops were there. But I say to him, like, you think that solved the problem? He's like, oh, definitely not. Like, someone's coming back here again. Someone's going to get shot here tonight for sure. And I said, like, then why are we leaving? And he's like, are you listening to the police radio in the car? Like, every 15 minutes on a Friday night in the summer on the south side of Chicago, there's a shots fired or man with a gun call. Like, we just don't have time to sit here and help this family learn how to live across the street from this family without this turning into the Hatfield and McCoys. And I think that helped me see, oh, I see. We clearly need the police to interrupt the brawl, but we also clearly need something else to come in on the heels of the police and really resolve and mediate the problem in a way that the police don't have the time or the inclination to do.
Or in some cases, like the Becoming a Man programs that try and intervene on the front end before young men get into these situations to teach them skills, and you find that actually has had a measurable impact.
Yeah. There are things that you can do on the front end as well to help people learn what they bring into these 10-minute windows to better help them navigate, and that also seems like a super promising approach.
So we're going to open the floor to questions. I don't know, is there a microphone that's going to be set up or is someone passing one? Oh, we have people passing microphones, but while they're getting into position and me using them as an excuse, I'm going to slip one more question in here, which is, there are lessons in your book and lessons to be learned about policing itself and the role that police play, because they're also, when I was a young police reporter at the Chicago Tribune, I was always aware that these police officers, they also have families. They want to get home safely and so on. And so they're subject to the same kinds of under pressure misjudgments. So talk about that and what could be done about that.
Yeah, so our very first project was with a nonprofit called Youth Guidance's Becoming a Man, as David mentioned, with teenagers, and we found that 15 to 20 hours of programming to help kids like better navigate these 10-minute windows reduced their violent crime arrest rate by like 50%. And then our colleague here at the Harris School in Drula DeBay had exactly the realization that you just had, which is another group of people who continually face very difficult 10-minute situations where their fast thinking can get them in trouble is cops. So she designed basically BAM for cops, and we worked with the Chicago Police, or Drula worked with the Chicago Police Department to do a giant randomized experiment of that. And you see similarly remarkable results: reductions in police use of force, reductions in low public safety value arrests, and a narrowing in arrest rates to black and white Chicago residents. So I think further evidence that this is not about the cognition of any particular group of people. It's like universal to all people making difficult decisions in really high stakes settings.
Do we have questions? Oh, we do. Yes, lots of hands. You guys choose people because I'm not going to get blamed for the ones who don't get chosen.
I have a microphone, so I guess I'll start over here.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Thanks. I want to hear your take on the involvement of lead and the abatement of lead and the reduction in the crime rate. Do you think that data is strong? And I guess the follow-up is there more lead to be abated to reduce the crime rate further?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the evidence, we could have a conversation about how other people read the research literature, but I think the evidence that links lead to crime is not bad. certainly, it's good enough for me to not feed my kid lead paint regularly.
I could think of a few other reasons. But.
Yeah, we can talk about that offline. Yeah, and I think like if you were of the sort of conventional wisdom perspective, you would think, oh, the reason that lead paint might matter for crime is to like lower people's lifetime earnings. But per the conversation, I don't think that's the mechanism. I think it's not hard to see that one of the channels through which lead paint and leaded gas. I'm old enough to have remembered leaded gasoline from the 70s. Like all of that surely had some beneficial effect to some degree on like population level decision making that must have been helpful in some way as well. And I think the data suggests that to some degree too.
Ian, thank you so much for speaking tonight. I had a question on how religion impacts kind of like some of these dynamics. I'm just like surprised there is not much more of kind of self-composure that's instilled in the community. So I'm curious if you've done any research on that.
Yeah, I think there's an accumulating body of research that suggests that anything that can promote mindfulness can be really helpful. So the Notre Dame Research Center did a really nice study a few years ago of like you give kids great books and you get them to reflect on it in a jail setting, and that winds up reducing recidivism. There are mindfulness studies that suggest RCTs, that randomized trials that show that can be helpful. And some jails have even done experiments where they randomly select some inmates to do journaling, which is a different way to like being mindful and reflective, and that winds up reducing recidivism as well. So I wouldn't don't take the becoming a man example as like a view that there is like some very specific brand name program that is the key, but rather it's like an orientation and a general sort of approach. Like anything that helps people develop that kind of muscle can be really helpful.
Hi, I actually am a violence interrupter, and I've worked with CRED. We're looking for volunteers if anyone is interested. I have two questions for you. One, how do we I agree with everything you've said. How do we get that message out more? And number two, the other challenge that we have in my neighborhood is that we look really great, but we're actually one of the most violent neighborhoods in the country. And the problem is the lines. A lot of people don't know about gang lines. So our organizations are trapped because they can't cross one line to the other, and even though there's resources, and they're sort of stuck into that world. Any thoughts on possible solutions to that?
Yeah, let me start with getting the message out. I think one of the reasons that it's been very hard to break out of this intellectual rut that we've been in for 100 years is because there has not been, there have been a lot of people proposing very specific policies, but they're not connected to any intuition people have about the cause of the problem, right? Like the analogy that I sometimes use is, it's like, imagine trying to explain to someone COVID prevention strategies in a world in which you do not have the germ theory of disease. It would be like, okay, here's your list. Wear a mask, stand 6 feet away from other people, maybe bleach your groceries. We could have a conversation about that, right? And then take a vaccine. It's like, boy, this seems like a super random set of things to do that make no sense to me. And I think in many ways, what I'm trying to do with the book is kind of to give a germ theory of disease, of violence, that helps you see. It's like there's becoming a man, and there's police interrupting things, and there is cleaning up vacant lots, and there's putting stores in neighborhoods. It's like, boy, does this seem like a weird collection of things. Sociologists talk about collective efficacy, the willingness of neighbors to sort of step in and intervene and address things. It feels like a super random, weird, disconnected, whatever. And hopefully now this gives us a framework to develop sort of a third conventional wisdom where it's like, oh, I get it. I get why all of these things sort of, So I'm hoping this will be super helpful to organizations like yours and to everybody doing this sort of work all across the country to help you see there is some sort of coherent strategy here.
Are you working in Roseland? Is that where you're working? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead. I should not have asked you. I wouldn't let you ask a follow-up, so I shouldn't ask you a follow-up. So, because I don't want to deprive others of a chance to ask questions, so perhaps after you can, okay.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
Hi. Hi, Jens. Great presentation. My question is maybe a little simplistic, but I took a class on the economics of cities, and one of the basic statistics we were told is the bigger the population, the more violence. How does that actually come into the stats when it comes to gun violence? Is that true? And if it is, and I'm thinking back to your example earlier about Switzerland versus Canada. Switzerland is smaller. Is there really a solution for bigger cities, bigger countries when it comes to gun violence and lowering it?
yeah, so it used to be the case, so great question. It used to be the case that there was like a fact that crime rates per capita were highest in the biggest cities in the country. LA, in 1991, the murder rate in LA, Chicago, and New York was 30 per 100. As a way to help you see how insane that is, the murder rate in London is usually 1 or 2 per 100,000. Right, so it's like, this would be like, you know, a national emergency in the United Kingdom if they had anything like what we have here in Chicago. And in the 30 years since 1991, the murder rate in LA dropped by 80% and the murder rate in New York dropped by 90%. And like, if you look at the city policy strategy, it doesn't say behavioral economics anywhere in there, but I would argue that a lot of the things that they did wind up being aligned with what the book would argue are really helpful things. And just to end on an optimistic note, going back to the previous, like, we see this problem generation after generation here in Chicago. They saw it generation after generation in LA and New York as well, and they've got a lot of gangs in LA as they have in Chicago. Lots of people think this problem is totally unsolvable. If you could time travel back to 1991 to LA and New York and say, guess what, the murder rate's going to decline by 80 to 90% over the next 30 years, people would think you're just absolutely crazy. And I think, maybe to end on an optimistic note, like the fact that 2 big American cities that had murder rates just like Chicago's as recently as 1991 managed to so dramatically change the problem in a world in which they still have poverty and segregation, there's still 400 million guns crossing city and state lines, should be a reason for hope for Chicago and every American city.
I have questions I could ask about that. I'm interested in that, about stop and frisk and so on, but we are out of time, right? Is that the... Well, nope. I would, but she will not allow it. But let me say, and just finish.
I'm happy to hang around.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just say, to echo what the dean said to start this program, sometimes academia seems very removed from the lives of people. One of the things that distinguishes Harris is that at the end of the day, the outcomes can have really dramatic impacts on the lives of people. And I just want to applaud you for spending so much of your life and so much of your brain power trying to understand this problem and trying to make a difference. Just be careful when you're walking the dog, okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everybody, for coming.